After years of love and sacrifice, Helen's life is shattered when her daughter-in-law, Maggie, betrays her, stealing everything she holds dear, including her husband's fortune. With nothing left but heartbreak, Helen must face the unthinkable: fight back or lose it all. But Maggie isn't going down without a fight. Can Helen reclaim what's rightfully hers before it's too late? Will she find the strength to face betrayal and save her family, or is everything lost forever? Helen sat in her favorite armchair, the one beside the window, with the pale light of the early morning creeping in through the blinds. The house was quiet, too quiet, as though it had forgotten the laughter, the arguments, the everyday bustle that had filled it once. Now it was just her, alone. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that broke the stillness. Helen stared out the window, the trees in the yard swaying gently in the autumn breeze, and her thoughts drifted back to the funeral, to the day everything had changed. At her husband George's funeral, there had been a hush in the air that only added to the weight of the moment. The family gathered, stiff with sorrow and guilt, yet Helen felt something else: a coldness. She hadn't expected much from the day. After all, George had been ill for so long and their marriage had been strained for years. Still, she hadn't anticipated the deep sting that would come when she walked into the room and saw her son Dylan and her daughter-in-law Maggie, speaking in hushed tones, their heads close together as though conspiring. Helen had pushed the thought aside at the time, chalking it up to the natural grief of losing a father and a husband. But as the day wore on, that odd feeling, that discomfort, lingered. It wasn't until the lawyers arrived that everything truly started to fall apart. Two men, dressed in dark suits, appeared at the door of the family home a few days later. Helen knew them both. They were George's trusted legal advisors, the ones who had managed his estate for years. They had always been professional, distant but reliable. They weren't the kind of men who made small talk. So when they asked her to sit down in the living room with them, she knew something was wrong. "Mrs. Parker," one of the lawyers began, his voice sharp, his eyes avoiding hers. "There's a matter of great importance we need to discuss regarding your husband's will." Helen nodded, her heart suddenly racing. She had never thought much about the details of George's will. She had trusted him after all. But that trust now felt like it was slipping from her fingers. She waited, her hands trembling slightly. The lawyer continued. "Your husband has left the entirety of his estate, his fortune, his property to your daughter-in-law, Maggie." The words didn't sink in at first. It was as though they were a foreign language, words that didn't belong in her reality. She blinked several times, her mouth dry. "Excuse me," she managed to whisper, but it felt like her voice wasn't her own. The second lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It's all legally binding. George signed the papers not long before his passing. He made Maggie the sole beneficiary." Helen felt the air leave her lungs. A tightness began to form in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She tried to speak, but no words came out. How could this be? Maggie? Her daughter-in-law? The same woman who had been so kind, so loving, or so it seemed. The same woman who had spent the past years by her side, helping take care of George in his final days? Helen's mind spun with disbelief, confusion, and a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. She thought of all the years she and George had spent together, the struggles, the sacrifices, the love they had built. And now it was all slipping away. Not only had George left everything to Maggie, but he had done it in secret, without so much as a word to Helen. The lawyers gave her some time to process, but no amount of time could make sense of what she had just heard. When they left, she was alone, sitting in the empty house that once buzzed with life. The walls, once full of warmth, now seemed cold, indifferent to her pain. Her son Dylan hadn't come home yet. He had been distant in the last few months of George's life, but Helen had brushed it off, thinking it was the stress of work, or perhaps the strain of caring for his ailing father. But now, as she sat in the silence of her home, the truth began to unfold. Maggie had been the one to take control of everything. She had worked her way into George's life, into his heart. And now she had taken what belonged to Helen, what Helen had worked for, what she had sacrificed for. It was all gone. Helen's thoughts grew darker. She had always been a woman of strength. She had endured the hardships of marriage, the ups and downs of raising a family, the heartache of losing a loved one. But this was different. This wasn't just the loss of a husband. This was the loss of everything she had built. Her hands tightened into fists as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the house or the property or the fortune. It was the betrayal. The crushing betrayal by the very people she had trusted the most. And it was all for the sake of money. As the evening grew darker, a plan began to form in Helen's mind. She couldn't just sit back and let Maggie and Dylan take everything from her. She had been humiliated, discarded like an old relic. But she wasn't finished yet. She would make sure Maggie knew what it felt like to lose everything. Helen had one thing left that Maggie didn't: experience. And she would use it. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, formulating her next move. Maggie might have the inheritance, but Helen would have the last laugh. She would take back what was hers. But first she needed to understand how deep the betrayal went, and she needed to understand the power she still held. Maggie wouldn't know what hit her.
Helen didn't sleep that night. She sat in her chair, staring out at the darkened yard, her thoughts churning in a relentless cycle. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again: the lawyers' faces, the cold finality of their words. Maggie is the sole beneficiary. It was a betrayal, plain and simple, but the weight of it didn't hit her fully until the silence of the house surrounded her. It wasn't just the fortune that had been stolen from her, it was something far worse. She had spent decades building a life with George. They had built their home together, raised their son, and made sacrifices to ensure their family thrived. But none of that mattered now. George was gone, and it seemed he had left her behind, forgotten, ignored, as if she were nothing more than a shadow in the corners of his life. As the morning light filtered through the blinds, Helen stood up, her bones aching from the hours of sitting in the same position. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stared at her reflection in the window above the sink. The woman who stared back at her was someone she hardly recognized. Her hair, once thick and dark, had turned silver over the years, her skin more lined, and the years of wear and tear from her life seemed to have settled in her eyes. Yet she was still there. That woman who had fought for everything she had, who had never been afraid of hard work, of standing up for what was hers. That woman was still in her, and she was about to make herself known again. Her hands shook as she held the cup. The bitterness of the coffee seemed to match the bitterness inside her heart. She had been humiliated, left to rot in a house that was now nothing more than a shell of what it used to be. She was nothing to her family now. Nothing to her son, Dylan, who had always been her pride and joy, her only child. He had distanced himself in recent years, but she had never imagined he would do something like this. Allow Maggie to manipulate him into turning against his own mother. Helen could feel the deep cracks in the family's foundation, cracks she had never seen coming. But the most painful part was Maggie. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted her? Maggie had always been charming, always played the role of the perfect daughter-in-law. She was always there, smiling, offering help when needed, making Helen feel like she was part of the family. But that was just a facade. Behind the kindness there had always been a hunger for power, for control. And now that hunger had claimed everything Helen had worked for. The more Helen thought about it, the angrier she became. She had let Maggie into her life, let her into her family, and now this was how she was repaid. Maggie had taken everything, but Helen knew she still had one thing left: her mind. Her intellect. Her ability to outsmart them all. Helen had always been good at reading people, at understanding what made them tick. She had always known when someone was hiding something, when someone was pretending. Maggie was no different. Helen's sharp eyes could see through her lies, and now she would use that to her advantage. The first step, she realized, was to understand what had happened. She needed to know how deep this betrayal went. How had Maggie managed to get George to sign over everything to her? It couldn't have happened overnight. There must have been manipulation, lies, and deceit. But to what extent? As Helen walked through the house, she began to gather the pieces. There were old letters, old documents, bits and pieces of George's business dealings that she had kept over the years. She sifted through them, looking for anything that might reveal what Maggie had done. It didn't take long for Helen to uncover a trail. There were a series of letters. written in George's handwriting, discussing investments, business ventures, and deals. At first they seemed innocuous enough. But as she read more carefully, a pattern began to emerge. There were mentions of Maggie, always in the background, always part of the conversation. And then it hit her. Maggie had been orchestrating this for years. Helen's mind raced as she pieced everything together. Maggie had worked her way into George's life long before his illness. She had become indispensable to him. His confidant, his support, and ultimately his lover. Helen had been so wrapped up in taking care of George, in making sure he was comfortable, that she had missed it. She had missed the signs of Maggie's growing influence. She had allowed Maggie to infiltrate their lives, and now she was paying the price for it. But Helen was far from defeated. In fact, she was just getting started. Maggie had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated Helen. She had thought the elderly woman was weak, helpless, and too old to do anything about it. But Helen was anything but weak. She still had the strength of will that had carried her through every trial in her life. And now she would use that strength to take back what was rightfully hers. Helen's plan was simple but effective. She would gather evidence of Maggie's manipulation and expose it. She would show Dylan the truth, make him see how he had been used. She would make Maggie pay for her deceit. But Helen knew that she had to be careful. This wasn't going to be a quick battle. It was going to take time, patience, and careful planning. As the sun set that evening, Helen stood at the kitchen window once more, her resolve hardening with each passing minute. She had been wronged. But she would not go down without a fight. The tables would turn. She would take back her power. And when she did, Maggie would be the one left with nothing.
Helen knew that Maggie would never see her coming. The young woman had been too confident, too sure that she had won. But Helen had seen this before. She had seen power games played by those who thought they could control everything. She had watched the world shift under the weight of greed, the way it bent to the will of those who were determined to take what they didn't deserve. And she had learned that the best way to fight was in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She spent the next few days preparing. Helen was methodical in her approach, never rushing, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The documents she had found, the letters and business papers, were crucial. They were the key to understanding Maggie's deception. But she couldn't reveal everything yet. No, she had to bide her time. Helen's son Dylan hadn't come by since the lawyers had delivered the news. She could feel his absence, the space growing between them like a chasm. He had always been so close to her, the boy she had raised with so much love and sacrifice. How could he have allowed this to happen? Was he really so blind? Or had he been complicit in his own way? The questions ate at her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on them. Not yet. She needed to understand Maggie's motivations. It was clear that Maggie had manipulated George, but how? What leverage had she used to ensure he signed everything over to her? Maggie was young, beautiful, and ambitious, qualities that had always made Helen wary. She had never trusted that sweetness, that outward charm. There was always something calculating behind her eyes. And now Helen could see it for what it was, a carefully crafted persona. Helen spent hours combing through George's business records, his financial statements, everything she could get her hands on. She even went through his personal journals, desperate for a clue, for any sign that he had been troubled by the changes in their life, the sudden shifts that had come when Maggie entered the picture. And then one night, as she sifted through the papers in the dim light of the study, she found it. A letter written by George, a confession of sorts. It was dated 2 months before his death, a time when his health had begun to fail him. The letter was to a lawyer, one she recognized from years ago. A man who had once helped George with some complicated business dealings. But what struck Helen wasn't the content of the letter itself, but the final sentence, the one that was meant for her eyes alone. "I fear my time is running out," George had written. "I have given Maggie too much power. I can no longer see clearly. Please protect my legacy. Make sure that when I am gone she does not get everything." Helen's heart skipped a beat. That letter had been George's last attempt at regaining control, at protecting the family legacy. But it was too late. Maggie had already manipulated George's final wishes, using her charm and cunning to secure everything for herself. Helen felt a mix of emotions, Rage, sorrow, and something deeper, a quiet resolve. She had been wronged. But George had known in his final days what was happening. He had tried to protect her, tried to shield her from this very betrayal. And yet he had failed. But Helen was not about to let his failure be her own. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she could make sure Maggie didn't get away with it. She could ensure that the truth came out, that justice was served. The next step was clear. She needed to confront Dylan. He was the key to unraveling the mess, and though it pained her to admit it, she would have to use everything she knew about him, about his weakness, to force him to see the truth. She waited until the weekend when Dylan was scheduled to visit. She made sure the house was quiet, the air thick with tension. When he arrived, she greeted him calmly, trying to mask the storm inside her. He was polite, distant, like a stranger in his own home. "Dylan," she began, her voice steady but with an edge of coldness that she couldn't suppress, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his face a mixture of guilt and avoidance. "Mom, I don't think now is the time." "It's time, Dylan," she interrupted. "It's long past time." She led him to the study, the place where she had uncovered everything. The place where the truth was buried under layers of deceit. She handed him the letter from George, the one he had never seen, the one that had never reached him in time. His face paled as he read it, the realization dawning slowly. The anger, the hurt, it was all there, written by his own father's hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dylan asked, his voice cracking with emotion. He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "I didn't know how to tell you," Helen replied quietly. "But I trusted you. I thought you would see what was happening, see how Maggie was manipulating us all. You were too close to it, Dylan. You couldn't see it." He lowered the letter, his hands trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know she was capable of this. I thought it was all above board. She's always been so." His voice trailed off as though he couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. "She's always been what?" Helen pressed, her tone sharp now. "She's always been the perfect daughter-in-law," he finally admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "But I never saw her like this. I didn't know she'd gone so far." Helen could see the shift in him. The realization had hit hard, and now he was beginning to understand the depth of Maggie's manipulation. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed him to do something to make it right. "I need you to help me, Dylan," she said, her voice low but firm. "We need to confront Maggie. We need to make sure she doesn't walk away with everything." Dylan hesitated. He knew what his mother was asking him to do, and it wasn't an easy decision. But in that moment he knew it was the right one. "Hey, Mom. I'll help you," he said finally. "But we have to be careful. Maggie is dangerous." Helen smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "I'm not afraid of her anymore. And neither should you be."
Helen had waited a long time for this moment, but now that it was here, a strange calm washed over her. Dylan had finally seen the truth she had known all along. But this was only the beginning. Now, with him on her side, she could move forward with her plan, no longer weighed down by the quiet resignation that had plagued her for weeks. The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in a long time, Helen felt alive. As the days passed, Dylan became more involved. At first, his efforts were hesitant, unsure, like a man just waking from a deep slumber. But with each passing day, his resolve hardened, and Helen could see the shift in him. She could see the man he was becoming, the man who would stand beside her to reclaim what was theirs. They spent hours discussing their next move. They knew that confronting Maggie head-on wasn't going to be easy. He was smart, too smart for her own good. But Maggie also had a weakness, a glaring one, and Helen was about to exploit it. Dylan was the key. He had access to the family finances, to the accounts and assets George had left behind. Maggie, despite everything she had manipulated, had not expected Dylan's sudden involvement. She had assumed she could continue her reign without resistance. But now the tables were beginning to turn. The first step was to gain control of George's accounts. Maggie had already taken the first legal steps to lock down his assets, but Dylan had been named the executor of the will, a decision George had made long before he fell ill. Dylan's role gave him the authority to challenge any of Maggie's claims. With that, they could begin to dismantle her carefully constructed empire. Helen knew that Maggie would not back down easily. She was cunning, and she had proven that she would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. But there was something Maggie hadn't counted on: Helen. Maggie had underestimated the strength and resilience of the woman she had discarded. And now Helen was coming for her. The phone call came just as Helen was finishing her lunch. She recognized the number immediately. It was Dylan. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. Maggie's made her move. Helen's heart skipped a beat. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "She's hired a lawyer. She's trying to get the will overturned," Dylan explained. "She's making it look like George was under duress when he signed it." Helen's stomach twisted into a knot. Maggie was playing dirty. But that didn't surprise her. "She's desperate," Helen muttered under her breath. "And she's not going to win. Not this time." "I need your help, Mom," Dylan said, the frustration evident in his voice. "I'm not sure how to fight this on my own." Helen's mind raced. This wasn't the time for hesitation. This was the moment they had been preparing for. She needed to act quickly, decisively. "We need to dig deeper, Dylan," she said, her voice low but filled with authority. "I've been going through George's old papers. There's a loophole. A way to prove that Maggie's claims are false. We need to find the original documents, the ones George signed when he made his will. We need to get them into the right hands." Dylan paused for a moment. Helen could hear the rustling of papers on his end, the sound of him flipping through something. "I know where they are," he said finally. "I'll go to the safe deposit box tonight. I'll get the papers." "Good," Helen replied. "And Dylan, don't tell Maggie anything." "Not yet. We need to keep this quiet. Once we have the documents, we can expose her." He hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. I won't tell her anything. I'll be careful." Helen's heart ached for her son. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He should never have had to fight this battle. But he was strong and he would come through. They both would. Later that evening, as Helen sat alone in the dim glow of the kitchen light, she reflected on everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought of George, her husband, the man she had loved for so many years. He had been her partner, her confidant, her best friend. And now his legacy was being torn apart by the very woman he had trusted. Helen clenched her fists, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. She had not asked for any of this. She had never wanted to be caught in a fight for power, for wealth. All she had ever wanted was a peaceful life, one where her family was close, where her husband was by her side. But now she had to fight. The thought of Maggie, with her calculated smile, her lies, her manipulation, filled Helen with a quiet fury. Maggie had taken advantage of George in his final days. She had wormed her way into his life, into their home, and now she was trying to take everything Helen had worked for. But Helen would not let her win. She would not let Maggie have her way. It wasn't long before Dylan arrived at the house, a small envelope clutched in his hand. He was breathless, his face pale with the effort of his mission. "Mom," he said, his voice strained. "I got them. I have the original documents. The ones George signed. We've got her." Helen's heart leapt in her chest. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. She stood up from her chair, walking toward Dylan. "Let me see them," she said, her voice steady. He handed her the envelope, and with trembling hands Helen opened it. Inside were the documents George had signed years ago, clear proof that his intentions had been true. There were no signs of manipulation, no evidence that he had been coerced. Maggie's claims were nothing but lies. Helen felt a rush of triumph. They had won the first round. But she knew there was more to come. Maggie would not give up easily. She would fight until the very end. But Helen was ready. She had prepared for this. And she would not rest until she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The next day, Helen and Dylan set their plan into motion. They took the documents to a trusted lawyer, one who had been George's friend for years. The lawyer was shocked when he saw the papers, and after reading them thoroughly, he confirmed what they had hoped. Maggie's claims were baseless. The will was legitimate and Helen had every right to the estate. With the legal support they needed, Helen felt the first flicker of hope in weeks. It was not over yet, but it was a start. They had the evidence. They had the truth on their side.
Helen's heart raced with anticipation as the days passed. The evidence was in their hands, the truth undeniable, but Maggie wasn't going to make this easy. No, she had already shown her willingness to fight dirty. Helen could feel the storm building, the tension mounting, and she knew this battle wasn't just about wealth or property. It was about reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been stolen from her. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would confront Maggie in front of the family. They would expose her lies, her manipulation, and her greed. But they had to do it carefully. Maggie had a way of twisting the narrative, making herself appear innocent, playing the victim. Helen knew that if they didn't play their cards right, everything they had worked for could unravel. Helen sat at the dining table, staring at the documents spread out before her. Dylan was pacing back and forth, running through the plan for what felt like the 100th time. Despite the confidence in his eyes, Helen could see the fear behind his words. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a battle for their family, for their future. It was a battle that would determine whether they could ever truly go back to the way things were. Maggie will try to make us look like the bad guys, Dylan said, his voice tinged with worry. She'll twist everything, Mom. She's good at that. We have to be careful. I know, Helen replied, her voice calm. But we have something she doesn't, the truth. The truth. It was such a simple thing, yet in the world they were living in now, it felt like the rarest commodity. Maggie had been able to manipulate everyone for so long, playing on their weaknesses, their desires. She had used her charm, her beauty, to make people believe she was something she wasn't. But Helen wasn't fooled. And she wasn't about to let her get away with it any longer. Are you sure about this? Dylan asked again. Once we confront her, there's no going back. Helen looked up at her son. The years of tension, the unspoken words between them had built up to this moment. Dylan had always been the one to stand by her, but now he was stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. This wasn't about love or family anymore. This was about survival. And Helen knew he had to be strong, stronger than he had ever been. I'm sure, she said softly. We don't have a choice. Maggie needs to know that no one, can take what doesn't belong to them. The meeting was set for that evening at the family home. Dylan had invited Maggie under the guise of a casual dinner. He knew she would be curious, but he also knew that once she walked through that door, there would be no turning back. Helen had dressed carefully as though she were preparing for a battle, because in many ways she was. She didn't want to look like the vulnerable, broken woman Maggie thought she was. She wanted to look powerful, in control, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. When Maggie arrived, she walked in with that same radiant smile. She was confident, almost too confident. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes impeccable. To anyone else, she would have appeared as the perfect daughter-in-law, the woman who had done everything right. But Helen saw past that. She saw the darkness beneath the surface. The manipulation, the ambition, the greed. Hello, Helen, Maggie said, her voice sweet but laced with something more. Dylan, nice to see you. Sit down, Maggie, Helen said, her voice steady. We need to talk. Maggie raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. About what? Helen didn't hesitate. She pushed the documents across the table toward Maggie. The papers were a clear challenge, a declaration that things were about to change. This, Helen said simply. It's time we talked about the will. About what George truly wanted. Maggie's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing slightly. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Helen replied, her voice firm. You've manipulated everyone, including George. You thought you could take everything from me. But you were wrong. Dylan stood behind Helen, his arms crossed over his chest. He said nothing, but the tension in the room was palpable. Maggie could feel it too. She could feel the shift, the power moving from her to them. You don't know what you're talking about, Maggie said, her voice growing colder. George wanted me to have everything. He trusted me. He didn't trust you. Helen's eyes flickered with anger, but she controlled it. He had to. Maggie wasn't going to win this. She wasn't going to twist the narrative like she always did. Not this time. No, Maggie, Helen said. You took advantage of George when he was vulnerable. You convinced him to sign over everything to you. But you didn't count on me. You didn't count on the truth coming out. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of the words just spoken. Maggie stood frozen for a moment, her gaze flickering between Helen and Dylan. She had expected this conversation, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. You think this is going to change anything? Maggie asked, her voice a bit shaky now. You think these papers are going to make a difference? George wanted me to have everything. I loved him. I was there for him when no one else was. I don't care what you think, Maggie, Helen shot back. George knew exactly what he was doing. He tried to protect me from you, but he couldn't. Now it's my turn to protect what's mine. Maggie's expression darkened. She looked between Helen and Dylan, her mind working quickly. She had been caught off guard, but she wasn't out of moves yet. You're just an old woman clinging to something that's gone, Maggie said, her voice venomous now. This isn't your fight anymore. Helen leaned forward, her eyes locking with Maggie's. This isn't just about the money, Maggie. This is about respect. And you've shown none of it. Not to me, not to George, and certainly not to Dylan. Maggie's face twisted with rage, but she knew she was losing ground. The truth was out and she couldn't deny it. The game was over. After a tense silence, Maggie stood up, her hands trembling slightly. This isn't over, Helen, she hissed. You may have won this round, but I won't stop until I get what I deserve. Helen didn't flinch. You'll never get it, Maggie. Not from me and not from Dylan. As Maggie stormed out of the room, Helen and Dylan stood together, the weight of the confrontation hanging in the air. They had done it. They had faced the truth, and in the end, it was the truth that had won. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt a sense of peace. Maggie had shown her true colors, and now there was no going back. The battle had only just begun, but Helen knew one thing for sure. She would never allow herself to be silenced again.
The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of tension and uncertainty. Maggie's departure had been swift, but the storm she left in her wake was far from over. Helen and Dylan knew that the battle wasn't won yet, despite their victory in the meeting. Maggie wasn't the type to back down just because the truth was on their side. No, she would regroup, find new ways to manipulate, and keep pushing until she got what she wanted. Helen wasn't naive enough to think it would end so easily. But the feeling of strength that had surged through her in that moment, when she had stood her ground against Maggie, stayed with her. She had been tested and she had fought back. The fear that had once paralyzed her, the fear of losing everything, the fear of facing a battle she couldn't win, was gone. In its place was something sharper, more resolute. Helen was ready to see this through to the end. That night, as she sat in the living room, a fire crackling softly in the hearth, she couldn't help but think of the years that had passed. She thought about how in her youth she had never imagined that one day her family, the people she had given so much to, would turn on her like this. She had always believed in the importance of family, in the bonds that should never be broken. But now those bonds had been tested, and in many ways they had broken. Dylan had spent the afternoon making phone calls to their lawyer, trying to anticipate Maggie's next move. He knew she would fight back. She wasn't the type to walk away quietly. But what Maggie hadn't counted on was the support they had now. With the documents in hand and the truth firmly on their side, they had the power to put an end to this. The first step, Helen had decided, was to take the legal route. Maggie had tried to manipulate the will, but now they had solid evidence to challenge her claims. They had the original documents signed by George that would prove her lies. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about protecting the family's legacy, about reclaiming the respect and honor that had been stolen from them. But even as Helen felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, she knew that the real fight was not with the lawyers, not with the papers, but with Maggie herself. The young woman had an almost terrifying ability to twist people's perceptions, to make them believe her version of events. She had done it to George, she had done it to Dylan, and now she was trying to do it to Helen. The next day, Helen received a call that would mark the beginning of the end for Maggie's reign. It was from their lawyer, a man named Richard who had worked with George for years. He was a calm, methodical man, someone who didn't make rash decisions. But even in his steady voice, there was a hint of urgency. "Helen," Richard said, "I've reviewed everything thoroughly. We have a strong case. But Maggie has already filed for a temporary restraining order, preventing you from accessing any assets in the estate. She's also trying to push the claim that George was not of sound mind when he signed the will." Helen's heart sank. She had known Maggie wouldn't give up easily, but hearing it confirmed by Richard was like a cold slap in the face. Maggie was pulling out all the stops, using the courts to delay everything to buy herself more time. It was a classic move, one that Helen had anticipated, but the reality of it still stung. "I won't back down, Richard," Helen said, her voice steady despite the anger rising inside her. "We have the truth on our side and we're not going to let her get away with this. Do whatever you have to do, but make sure we're ready for the next step." "I understand," Richard replied. "I'll make the necessary motions. But we may need to act fast. The longer this drags on, the more it benefits Maggie." Helen hung up the phone, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over. The war had only just begun. But she also knew that Maggie had just made a fatal mistake. By pushing this restraining order, by trying to twist the narrative once again, she had revealed her true colors. And now there would be no way to hide. Helen turned to Dylan, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, lost in his own thoughts. He had been processing everything just as she had, but he had always been more reserved, more cautious. She could see that he was struggling with the idea of fighting his own family, especially Maggie, the woman he had once loved. "You heard the news?" Helen asked him softly. Dylan nodded, his face grim. "I did. But we can't let her get away with this, Mom. We can't let her manipulate the system like she always does." "No," Helen said, her voice hardening. "We won't. We've come too far to back down now. This isn't just about money. This is about making sure no one ever does this to us again. We need to show her that there's no escaping the truth." Dylan met his mother's gaze, his expression determined. "I'm with you. We'll fight this together." The following days were a blur of legal meetings, court filings, and strategy sessions. Helen felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, but she didn't falter. She had the truth and she would make sure it came to light. She knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but she was done being passive. Done being the woman who allowed herself to be stepped on. Meanwhile, Maggie continued to stir the pot. She was working the family, spreading lies, trying to turn everyone against Helen. It was a familiar tactic, one she had used before. She would charm them, manipulate them, make them see her as the victim. And for a while it had worked. But now the truth was beginning to spread, and it was too late for Maggie to fix the damage she had caused. The day of the hearing arrived. It was a cold, gray morning, the kind of day that made everything feel heavier, more foreboding. Helen and Dylan sat in the waiting room of the courthouse, the silence between them thick with anticipation. They both knew what was at stake. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. When the courtroom doors opened and they were called in, Helen stood up, her spine straight, her steps steady. She had come a long way from the woman who had felt powerless in the face of Maggie's manipulation. She was no longer just George's widow, trying to hold on to what little she had left. She was a woman fighting for her legacy, for her son, for her dignity. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. As they entered the courtroom, Maggie was already seated, her lawyer by her side. She looked up at Helen with a cool smile, as though she still believed she had the upper hand. But Helen could see the fear in her eyes. Maggie was beginning to understand that the game was over. The hearing went as expected. Maggie's lawyer tried to present his case, but Helen's legal team was ready. Richard presented the documents, the evidence, and the witnesses who would testify to George's state of mind when he signed the will. Slowly but surely, the truth began to emerge and Maggie's lies started to unravel. By the end of the hearing, it was clear. Maggie had lost. The judge ruled in favor of Helen and Dylan, and the restraining order was lifted. Maggie was no longer able to manipulate the estate. The inheritance, the property, everything George had left behind, was now legally theirs.
The day after the hearing, the weight of the victory began to settle in. Helen could feel it in her bones, in the way she moved through the house, in the silence that surrounded her. For the first time in months, there was no looming threat of Maggie's manipulations. The air felt lighter, as though a dark cloud that had been hanging over her for far too long had finally lifted. But even as she allowed herself a moment of relief, Helen knew the battle was not quite over. Maggie had lost, but that did not mean she was out of the picture entirely. She was still dangerous, still capable of stirring trouble. Helen had seen the way Maggie had turned the situation to her advantage before, and it wouldn't take much for her to try and claw her way back. Helen sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window, gazing out at the yard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the light filtering through the leaves casting soft shadows across the grass. It was peaceful, but her mind was far from calm. She had spent years building a life with George, years of hard work, sacrifice, and love. And now, after everything that had happened, it felt as though nothing was truly hers anymore. But she had to keep going. For Dylan. For George's legacy. She wouldn't allow Maggie's greed to rewrite everything they had built. Dylan was quiet, still processing the aftermath of the hearing. It had been a roller coaster for him, from disbelief to shock, to a strange sense of victory. But the relief he felt was tempered by the fact that they still had to pick up the pieces of their shattered family. Maggie's betrayal had left scars, and no matter what they had won in court, those scars would take time to heal. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness. Helen picked it up, her heart racing as she saw the number on the screen. It was Richard, their lawyer. "Helen, I have some news," he said, his voice tense. "It seems Maggie is not giving up just yet." Helen's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "She's filed an appeal. She's not accepting the ruling, and she's taking it to a higher court. She's fighting this with everything she has. It's not over." Helen's grip on the phone tightened. "I thought we had won. We did legally. But she's not going down without a fight. She's desperate, and when someone like Maggie is desperate, they'll do anything to win. We're going to need to prepare for another round." Helen exhaled slowly, a cold resolve settling over her. This wasn't over. Maggie was making her final move. But Helen wasn't about to let her have the last word. She had fought too long, too hard. "We'll be ready," Helen said, her voice steady, though inside her mind was racing. She hung up the phone and turned to Dylan, who had been listening intently. "Another round?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "She's appealing," Helen replied, her voice hardening with determination. "But we've come this far and we're not stopping now. We'll fight this to the end." Dylan nodded slowly, his jaw set in a firm line. "I won't let her get away with it, Mom. We've been through too much for her to just take it all back." Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. But this time we do things differently. This time we take control. Maggie won't win. Not this time." The following weeks were filled with legal battles, constant meetings, and more paperwork than Helen had ever imagined. But with each passing day she grew more resolute. Maggie's tricks, her manipulation, her lies, they had all been exposed. And no matter how hard Maggie fought, no matter how many legal avenues she pursued, she couldn't change the truth. Helen's relationship with Dylan, too, began to shift. The tension that had existed between them, the unspoken frustrations, the quiet disappointments, began to fade. They were a team now, working together, fighting together. They weren't just mother and son anymore. They were partners in a battle for their family's future. And that bond, that strength, was something Maggie could never take from them. The next court date came and went, the final chapter in their legal struggle. Maggie's appeal had been swiftly rejected, her claims dismissed by the higher court. She had fought fiercely, but in the end she couldn't overcome the weight of the truth. The legal victory was a hard one, but it was still a victory. The estate was finally, irrevocably Helen's and Dylan's. There was no longer any question of who held the rights to George's legacy. But even as the court ruled in their favor, Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. As she had won. Yes, she had reclaimed her dignity and her inheritance. But the cost had been high. The betrayal from Maggie, the years of manipulation, the toll it had taken on her family, it was a heavy burden to carry. It was only a few days later that Maggie came to see her. Helen had been expecting it. She had known Maggie wouldn't just fade into the background, disappear quietly. Maggie's ego was too large, her ambition too great. And so, when she knocked on the door that evening, Helen wasn't surprised. She opened the door slowly, standing in the threshold. Maggie was there, standing on the porch, her posture stiff, her expression guarded. "I want to talk," Maggie said, her voice cold but measured. Helen stepped back, allowing Maggie to enter. They walked into the living room, the same room where their confrontation had begun months earlier. The tension was thick in the air. "What do you want, Maggie?" Helen asked, her voice low but firm. Maggie looked at her for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I was wrong, Helen. I thought I was doing what was best for me. But I didn't see the damage it would cause. I was blinded by my own ambition. I hurt you and I hurt Dylan, and for that I'm sorry." Helen studied her, her face unreadable. She had heard Maggie's words before. The excuses, the justifications. But there was something different in her voice now. It wasn't the confident, manipulative tone Helen had heard so many times before. There was a vulnerability in it, a crack in the facade. Helen took a deep breath, her mind weighing the decision. "You can't undo what you've done, Maggie. You can't take back the pain you've caused. But maybe there's a way forward for us." Maggie's eyes flickered with something like hope. "You're willing to forgive me?" "I'm willing to try," Helen said, her voice softening just a fraction. "But trust is earned, Maggie. It won't happen overnight." For the first time in months, a small, genuine smile crossed Maggie's face. It was tentative, fragile, but it was there. And for Helen that was enough.
The weeks that followed the courtroom victory brought a sense of strange peace. Maggie's appeal had been swiftly dismissed, and with the estate finally under Helen and Dylan's control, it seemed like the worst was behind them. The chaos of the past few months, the legal battles, the constant threat of Maggie's manipulation, had all settled into a quiet, uneasy calm. But while Helen could breathe easier knowing the legal battles were over, she knew the emotional scars of the betrayal would take much longer to heal. That night, as Helen sat in the quiet of her home, a feeling of emptiness lingered. The victory had been sweet, but it had come at such a high cost. Maggie's betrayal had stretched deep into the fabric of their family, and no amount of legal paperwork could undo the hurt that had been inflicted. Dylan had been by her side through it all, his support unwavering. But even he could not escape the damage. He had trusted Maggie, loved her, and to have that trust shattered had left him in a quiet turmoil that Helen could see beneath his calm exterior. There were nights when he would disappear into the study, looking over papers, pretending to focus on something other than the turmoil in his heart. He would never admit it, but Helen knew. In the early morning hours when the house was still and the world outside was asleep, Helen would often think back to George, their life together, the bond they had shared. The memories of their earlier years felt distant, blurred by the weight of everything that had happened. George had been her partner, her equal, her best friend. And now, in his absence, she felt the void where his presence had once been so strong. But there was something else, something that Helen had pushed aside for too long. The truth about the past, about how George and Maggie had become so close. There were whispers in the letters George had written to his lawyer, in the quiet moments she had spent reading through his final notes. Maggie had worked her way into their lives, into George's heart, and Helen had never fully understood the depth of that connection until now. She had ignored it, pushed it down, because she had never wanted to face the ugly reality of what had truly happened in those final months. But now, with everything that had been laid bare, it seemed impossible to continue pretending that things were the way they had always seemed. The next morning, as Helen and Dylan sat over breakfast, she broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. It wasn't easy, but it had to be done. "Dylan," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to talk about George. About what really happened in those final months." Dylan paused, his spoon hovering over his cereal. He had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was coming. "I've been thinking about that too, Mom. I don't think I've fully processed everything. It's hard to. I loved her, and I trusted her." Helen nodded, her gaze steady on her son. "I know. I trusted her too. But Maggie wasn't the woman we thought she was. She was never just your wife, Dylan. She was always something more to George. Something I didn't see. Something that's hard for me to face now, but I have to." Dylan set his spoon down and looked at his mother. "What are you saying, Mom?" Helen took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the edge of her coffee mug. "I'm saying that George knew what she was doing. He knew what was happening between them, And he never told me. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of silence. Dylan sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The revelation was like a blow to the chest, something that hit him harder than he had expected. Are you saying that George knew all along? Knew what Maggie was planning? Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen nodded. I don't think George fully understood what was happening at first, but I believe he realized it in those last months. He was too ill to do anything about it, and by then, Maggie had already worked her way into everything. Into his heart, into his business, into his life. But he tried to protect me, Dylan. He tried to protect us, but he couldn't. And I couldn't see it. I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Dylan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with emotion. I don't know what to say, Mom. I feel like I've been living a lie. Like everything we had, everything I thought I knew about my life has been turned upside down. Helen reached across the table, placing her hand on his. I know, darling. I feel the same way. But this is the truth. And we have to face it together. We can't change the past, but we can decide what we do with what's left. Dylan squeezed her hand, his eyes misty. I don't want to lose you, Mom. I don't want to lose what's left of our family. I've already lost so much. Helen smiled softly, brushing away a tear from her own cheek. We won't lose each other, Dylan. We've been through too much. This family might have been torn apart, but we can rebuild it. We can start over. As the days passed, the weight of the past began to lift, but not without effort. Helen and Dylan spent hours talking, working through the pain of the betrayal and trying to understand what had happened in those last, chaotic months of George's life. It wasn't easy. The memories of Maggie's manipulation, of the lies and deceit, were still fresh. But they had each other, and that was what mattered now. Maggie, for her part, had disappeared from the scene. She had not come back to the house, and as far as Helen and Dylan knew, she had moved on to other things. Perhaps other schemes, other people to manipulate. Helen didn't care. Maggie was no longer their concern. The estate, the inheritance, everything that had once been tied to her was now in their hands, and that was all that mattered. But Maggie's departure, while welcomed, left a strange emptiness in its wake. The closure that Helen had hoped for did not come in the form of a final confrontation or a moment of triumph. Instead, it came slowly, in the quiet moments she spent with Dylan, in the way they had begun to rebuild their relationship, brick by brick. And in those quiet moments, Helen realized that the greatest inheritance George had left behind wasn't the money, the property, or the legacy of business. It was the love and strength of her family. That was what she had to fight for, and it was what she would protect for the rest of her days.
The days turned into weeks, and the feeling of uncertainty that had plagued Helen began to fade. The emotional weight of the battle, the betrayals, and the overwhelming strain of the legal fight had all taken their toll, but now it was time to move forward. The house, once filled with tension, now felt like home again. Quiet, familiar, and full of the promise of a future that didn't involve Maggie's manipulation or the shadows of the past. Helen had spent so many years focusing on what was being taken from her. Her family, her home, her legacy, that she had forgotten to appreciate the things she still had. She still had Dylan. She still had her strength, her dignity, and her will to fight. Those were the things that mattered now. Not the inheritance, not the wealth. The love and respect that had been nearly ripped from her were still intact, and that was something Maggie could never take away. It was a late afternoon when Dylan came into the living room, where Helen sat looking through old family photos. The sunlight was casting long shadows across the floor, and the dust particles floated lazily in the warm glow. Helen smiled to herself as she ran her fingers over the photographs, each one a memory of a life that had been full of love, laughter, and hardship. But they had weathered it all. "Mom," Dylan said softly, breaking her reverie. He walked in, his expression somber but not burdened. There was a calm in him now that hadn't been there for months. He had always been the protector, the one who stepped in when things got difficult. But now, it seemed like he was ready to finally lay down the weight of everything he'd been carrying. Helen turned to him, her eyes soft with affection. "What is it, darling?" "I've been thinking," Dylan began, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "I don't want to hold on to the anger anymore. It's been eating away at me. I want to let go of all of it." Helen nodded slowly, understanding. It's hard to let go of the hurt, isn't it? Yeah, Dylan replied. But I don't want my life to be defined by what Maggie did. I don't want to keep letting her control me from a distance. I'm ready to move forward. To rebuild. Helen's heart swelled with pride. Her son, the man she had raised with so much love, was finally coming into his own. He was no longer the boy who had been manipulated by Maggie's charm, but a man who was ready to forge his own path. He was ready to take his place as the protector of the family's future, not just the heir to the estate, but the keeper of its legacy. I'm proud of you, Dylan, Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. You've been through so much, but you've come through it stronger. You're right. We can't let the past define us. It's time to let go of the pain and move forward together. Dylan smiled, a quiet weight lifting off his shoulders. I think it's time we start over, don't you? Helen nodded. It's time. The next few days were filled with small but significant moments. The house, once a battleground, became a home again. Dylan and Helen worked together to clean out the remnants of the past. Old letters, forgotten documents, the things that had tied them to the betrayal. They didn't burn them, they didn't need to. They simply packed them away, locking them in the past where they belonged. They even went through George's study, a place Helen had avoided for months, unable to face the memories of her late husband. But now, with Dylan by her side, it felt like the right time. They found old journals, family records, and documents that George had kept carefully. There were no surprises in those pages, no hidden truths. Just a man who had loved his family, who had tried his best to provide for them, and who had, in the end, been a victim of his own trust. But even in that final act of sorting through the remnants of George's life, Helen realized something important. She had spent so much time holding on to the pain of betrayal that she had forgotten to honor the good that George had given her. He had been imperfect, as all people are, but he had loved her. And now it was time to remember that love, not just the hurt. The evening after they finished clearing out the study, Helen and Dylan sat down at the dinner table. It was quiet, a different kind of silence than they had experienced before. It wasn't filled with fear or tension anymore. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. I was thinking, Dylan began, his voice calm. We could use some of the estate money to give back. To do something good with it. There's a local shelter in town. One that helps women and children who've been abused. I think we should donate to it. Help them rebuild like we're rebuilding. Helen looked at him, touched by the idea. That's a beautiful thought, Dylan. We've been given so much, and I think it's time we give something back. They spent the rest of the evening discussing how they could use their resources to make a difference, to take the power they had regained and use it for something meaningful. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Several months later, the house was finally a place of peace. Helen and Dylan had settled into their new lives, their bond stronger than ever. Maggie had disappeared from their lives completely, and Helen found that, with each passing day, the bitterness of the past faded just a little bit more. She had learned a valuable lesson. No one could take what was truly hers, not unless she allowed them to. And the one thing no one could ever take away from her was the love of her son and the legacy of their family. Helen stood in the front yard one morning looking out over the land. The trees were in full bloom, the grass a rich green. Everything felt renewed. The past was behind her, and the future was something to look forward to. Dylan was in the garden, planting new flowers, bringing life back into the space they had once almost lost. As Helen watched him, a sense of calm washed over her. She had fought for what was rightfully hers, but more than that, she had fought for what mattered most, her family. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. In life, betrayal often cuts deepest when it comes from those we trust the most. Helen, a woman who had built a life of love and sacrifice, was blindsided by her daughter-in-law, Maggie, who manipulated both her and her husband for years. The pain of losing her husband, the man she had trusted, was compounded when Maggie seized everything, including the family estate, leaving Helen vulnerable and discarded. But Helen, resilient and sharp, refused to be a victim. Through her strength and resolve, she uncovered the truth, fought back with the help of her son, Dylan, and ultimately reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The court battle was fierce, but in the end, Helen triumphed. More than just the inheritance, it was the dignity and respect she fought for. It was a fight against greed, manipulation, and betrayal, a fight for justice. But the greatest victory wasn't the wealth or the property. It was the strength of family, of rebuilding trust, of moving forward, and of giving back to others. In the end, Helen's battle showed that no matter how hard life tries to break us, it's our family, our values, and our love that will always rise above. Let Helen's story remind us all that no matter the obstacles, we can overcome betrayal and rebuild what's been lost. Stay strong, fight for what's right, and never forget the importance of family, trust, and the power of truth.